Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting me to Newham Academy. I've heard about your stellar reputation on the academic side, and it's a pleasure to be here. I thought what I would do is talk to you for 20 minutes, something like that, and then take as many questions and answers as you want to throw at me. And I'll divide what I want to say into several bits. I think, first of all, I'll explain how I got into politics in the first place, and I have a quite unusual trajectory. I mean, most politicians are professional politicians. They went to university, became researchers, became MPs, became ministers, and Cameron, Osborne, Clegg, Miliband, most of the people you see on the telly went through that route. I didn't. I didn't get into Parliament till my mid-50s. I was seen as quite old at that time. And I became a cabinet minister in my late 60s, and I was well past most people's retirement, and I had one of the biggest jobs in the government when I was quite advanced years by political terms. So my own profile is a bit unusual, but I'll explain how I got into this. And then I'll talk about the coalition government that I was part of for 5 years and how we got into it and what we did. And then a little bit at the end about where we are now. As Rachel's just explained, I've just produced a book, which is a sequel to a bestseller I did in 2008, about the economy, why we got into the economic crisis, what's happening now, what's happening globally, and I'll talk a bit about that at the end. But in terms of where I came from, I started out like many of you from quite humble backgrounds. My parents were factory workers. They left school at 15, hadn't had a proper education, but they were very ambitious, hard-working people, and they made me work hard, do my O-levels as they were called, now GCSEs and A-levels. And I got into Cambridge to become a scientist, and then I switched to economics. But I just think one other thing about my upbringing, which helps to explain why I'm here, is my dad, although he was in many ways a great guy. I mean, he was very, very industrious, and he'd worked his way up from the shop floor to become a lecturer in a tech college. He had a lot of the prejudices of his generation, kind of white working class, if you like, brought up with the British Empire and believed in it. And I was starting to challenge, question a lot of his views. So by the time I was 14 or 15, I was having to debate and argue with my father about his politics. And that, in a way, was the beginning of my introduction to political life. And I had two friends that I made in the sixth form, one of whom was a communist, and the other of whom was a deep-dyed conservative. And we used to walk around the streets of York, eating fish and chips in the evening and debating politics. And that's in a way where I kind of started to develop my interest. But after I'd left university, I went off to Kenya. My first big job. It was a fantastic job. I worked for the Kenya government. It was shortly after independence. President Kenyatta was then in charge, and I was put into the treasury to help manage the country's economy. And the way it was a kind of ridiculous level of responsibility. But what had happened was that the colonial powers were going. A lot of the expatriates had left the country, the African graduates hadn't yet come through, and people like me were filling in the gap in between. So I got a marvelous job, which helped me to understand economics in the real world. And I got on from that to doing much of the rest of my life, actually working on the economics of development. And I spent much of the remainder of my professional life in Africa, in Latin America and India on issues around development. But something else happened in Kenya which helped to shape the rest of my life, actually, is that I got married, and my wife was Kenyan, Indian origin. And this is quite commonplace now, but in those days it was very unusual. and we both fell out with our families. My late wife had an arranged marriage, and I broke all that up. And my father had very strong racial attitudes, and between the two of them, they said, we don't have anything to do with you. So we went our separate way, and we had nothing to do with our families for some years until we eventually had children and we got reconciled, and it was sort of lived happily ever after, as it were. But we went through that quite difficult stage, and the earlier part of my adult life was operating within a kind of mixed marriage, mixed family in a society, Britain, this was Britain in the late 60s, early 70s, where prejudices were still very strong, and there was a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric, and I lived in Glasgow with my wife, but if you had a brown skin, you were not welcome, and that was the kind of environment in which I embarked on adult life. But after living in Kenya for a few years, I went back to Britain when we settled in Glasgow in Scotland, and embarked on several things which helped to shape my view of the world. First of all, I started a professional career in economics, and I used to lecture economics at the university. But I also started getting involved in politics. I was in the Labour Party at that time, became a Glasgow city councillor, helped to run the city of Glasgow. I was only in my 20s at that stage and stood for Parliament for the first time. And began quite a long period in the Labour movement. I wrote a book with Gordon Brown. It's not widely known. I think it's reputed that when he became Prime Minister, he rounded up all the copies and had them burnt. So he was a bit embarrassed by it, but anyway, we jointly did a book. And I also worked for John Smith, who was the leader of the Labour Party at that time. The reason why I finished up doing what I did was that in the Labour Party in the late 1970s, there was a civil war. Some of the people who you now have heard of, like Mr. Corbyn and Ken Livingstone, people of that kind, were on the other side, and I was on one side. And the people in my general position, social democrats, if you like, we eventually, after the political fighting became very intense, particularly in London, where I'd moved, we moved out and we formed a new party called the Social Democrats, who merged with the Liberals to become the Lib Dems, and that's in a way the history of it. But because I hadn't broken through in politics, I went about my professional life and developed skills as an economist, and finished up, as you've just heard, working for Shell, the international oil company. And my job there was to do kind of big, long-term strategic planning, thinking about the future, and as part of that, helping the company to prepare to enter Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, China, India, and I also had to deal with Nigeria. There was then under a particularly vicious dictatorship. I had to deal with the dictator. It was not a pleasant experience. And after that, Parliament. And long years in opposition. We had Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and then finding myself in the government in 2010. So that's a quick sketch of how I got to be what I am, and it's a long and winding road. And for those of you who are thinking you might want to get involved in politics at some stage, it is a reminder that in politics, a lot of it's about luck. A lot of it's about being in the right place at the right time, in the right party, obviously. And in my case, it was almost 30 years between the first time I stood for Parliament and when I actually got in. And that's unusual, but not unique. And there are very, very able people who never got into Parliament. They were, as I say, in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I think if you are contemplating political activism, a political career, you do need to bear this in mind. It's a very unpredictable business, and people can be heroes one minute and zeros the next. Parties break up, they reform, you go up, you go down. It's that very much that kind of world. But let me just say a little bit about the coalition and my role in it. I don't know how many of you were thinking of politics 5 years ago, but it was a very unusual situation. In Britain, we'd never had coalition government since the war, and that was a very artificial situation. It was something Britain wasn't used to. We'd had a two-party system in the UK pretty much till after the First World War, and of course, as you'll know from your history, in the 19th century, the Tories, the Conservatives and the Liberals dominated, and then the Liberals fractured, split up after the First World War, and the Labour Party gradually moved into that space. And we'd had certainly through most of my political lifetime, we effectively had a two-party system. Tories, Labour took it in turns. The Liberals and then the Lib Dems were gradually emerging as a challenger, but were still very much in third place. However, in 2010, we had what's called a hung parliament. No party won. The problem at that time was the numbers. My own personal preference would have been to have had a coalition with the Labour Party. I had a very good friendship with Gordon Brown. I was endeavoured to negotiate with him such a coalition, but the numbers were not there. There weren't enough MPs to create a stable government. And in addition, we had a big economic crisis. I'll come back to that later. But at the time, Europe looked as if it was on fire. There was a major crisis erupting in Greece. The banks had just collapsed a year or so earlier. We were in the middle of a crisis, the like of which we hadn't had in Britain since the middle of the 19th century, actually. It was uniquely challenging. And there was a very strong feeling that parties had to work together in the national interest. So basically, we agreed to work with the Conservatives. It was not easy. People like me had spent all our lives fighting the Conservatives, but nonetheless, there was a national interest involved, so we formed the coalition. I was one of the two major economic ministers. George Osborne obviously had the Chancellor's job, and I had the so-called business department, which was responsible for anything to do with business, industry, trade, but also universities, further education, training, and science. And that was my empire. And we had 5 very difficult years, which mostly involved trying to stabilize the British economy after the shock of the financial crisis in 2008. This involved some very painful decisions. It's come to be called austerity. And people have argued about whether we did too much or too little, but something had to be done. The government couldn't just sit there. But we did indeed stabilize the economy. It subsequently started to grow. We didn't have mass unemployment. Employment has been growing, and certainly in the last year or so, we've begun to get back to the levels of employment and living standards that people enjoyed before the crash, but it has been very painful and very difficult. And one of the things which I had to do, which you should think about if you're ever going to go into business, you're likely to be confronted with this kind of problem, is I was running a big department with 3,000 people directly, and I was ultimately responsible for about 1 million people actually in different walks of life. We had to cut 25% from the budget. And this is what happens in a financial crisis. And so many very painful decisions had to be made affecting colleges, universities, and other things. But nonetheless, we got through it. And by the end of the government, the economy was getting back onto some kind of balance. One of the stories about the coalition, which is only now beginning to emerge, is that there was a great deal of conflict, I mean not physical, but tension between the two parties. I was seen as being very much on the left of the coalition, but nonetheless trying to work on a partnership basis with the Conservatives. and although, in many ways it was difficult, we did have what I like to think is a fairly mature approach to it. I had 8 ministers in my department, 2 Lib Dems, 6 Conservatives, and I basically said to them, look, you leave your weapons at the door. We've got a job to do. We've got legislation to pass. We've got to work as a team, whether you like it or not. And we did actually do a very substantial amount. And in the course of the 5 years that I was there, I think the things that I'm proudest of having done is we launched what we call an industrial strategy to try to inject revival into British industry, the car industry, which is now doing very well. Ford down in Dagenham are booming, partly as a consequence of the support we gave them. The aerospace industry, the new biological sciences, which are booming in the UK, creative industries, and I sat down and worked with the key people in those industries to try to plan out a long-term plan for them. I also set up 2 new banks owned by the state. One of them was called the Green Investment Bank, which is to finance long-term environmental activities, things like energy saving, energy efficiency, waste disposal, and it's now allocated something of the order of 10 billion, most of it private money that they've matched. And we also set up something called the British Business Bank, because after a banking crisis, banks stopped lending to ordinary businesses, small businesses, and we set up a special bank which has created a lot of internet lending. Those of you who've got families in the small, medium-sized business community will know how difficult they find it to raise credit. So we've created a bank which enables people now to raise funding on the internet, peer-to-peer lending it's called, and in other ways. I think a third thing that I spent a lot of time doing was trying to revive British science. What happens in Britain is that we have some of the most brilliant scientists in the world, but much of that doesn't get through into industry. And we're quite behind Germany, particularly in terms of what's called innovation. So we protected the budget for science, particularly in universities, and we invested a lot of money in what were called catapults or innovation centres, which are now scattered around the country and are now doing very well. There are several in London, one of them on new digital technologies, and this is providing the support for growth companies in the long run. We did other things which were more controversial. One of the things I had to do was to reform the financing of universities, and we had all that horrible stuff around tuition fees, but the consequence of it was that universities have now plenty of money, and the way we devised it is that nobody has to pay any money to go to universities. You pay it later through what is a form of graduate tax, and after you graduate you don't pay anything till you're earning 21,000, and then you prepay in relation to your income. It was very controversial, but as a result of it, the universities are flourishing, and there are more people from underprivileged backgrounds now going to universities than ever before. But the other thing I tried to do, and this may not be quite such a relevant message for you, was to try to make sure that we didn't devalue the people who wanted to do vocational education. Because what's happened in Britain over the years is that if you are traditionally, people who go to university are seen as being up here, and if you don't go to university and become a skilled worker or just an ordinary factory worker, you're seen as down there, and a kind of apartheid developed between the brainy academics and the others. I thought this is terribly wrong. Not just terribly wrong, it's also very inefficient, because Britain is chronically short of highly skilled people. One of the reasons we're not building enough houses is the fact that we just don't have enough skilled workers, plumbers, bricklayers, people of that kind. So I put a lot of money into apprenticeship training, and I've been trying to encourage schools to think about good vocational education as an alternative to university for some people who want to do it. And if you go through a proper vocational route, skill level 3, 4, 5, that's the equivalent of a university degree, and of course you don't have to borrow to do it. It's somebody else pays for it usually. We did these major reforms of higher and further education, which of course affects your lives in future. So that's really all I want to say about that government, and I'll round off what I want to say by saying a little bit about what I'm doing now and where I think we are. One of the things I did when I left the government was, and I'd lost my parliamentary seat and my job in the government because the Lib Dems had a terrible election and most of us lost, so I had to get on with my life. And I wrote that book rather quickly, and it's a sequel to a best-selling book I wrote at the time of the financial crisis back in 2008. Because, how many of you here do economics? Right, okay, well in that case I should develop a little bit more. What we realized back in 2008 was that conventional economics didn't predict or explain what was going on. The standard theory of finance was based on what we call efficient financial markets, that markets always correct themselves. And this was clearly nonsense because the whole system had collapsed in a heap as a result of reckless lending by the banking system and very, very complicated financial derivatives. I don't know how far you've gone into that in your A-level course. And in order to understand what had happened, I had to go back into history. There were some great writers like Hyman Minsky, Kindleberger, who had written about financial crisis, but they'd long since been removed from the syllabus. And I tried to bring them out to explain what had happened. And the best account I got of what was happening 7 years ago was in the pages of a philosopher called John Stuart Mill, who wrote in the beginning of the 19th century. And everybody had completely forgotten what happens when you have a banking collapse. So what I've tried to do with this new book is to go have a look at where we are now and contrast it with what was happening 7 years ago. And although I don't want to talk all day about it, just to summarize some of the main points. The first is that since 2008, what has actually kept the world going economically is the big emerging markets led by China, to some extent India, mainly China. China is now the biggest economy in the world. It's overtaken the United States in terms of sheer scale. It's a poor country, but it's massive. Their development has been absolutely phenomenal. And since the death of Mao Zedong, they reformed their economy and become actually, although they're a communist country, they're very capitalist and very successful in economic growth. And they've been driving the world economy, India to a lesser extent, countries like Brazil and Russia as well. And that's what sort of powered the world economy. And the whole, if you like, the whole center of gravity of the world economy has shifted to those countries. But what's happening now is that China in particular is running into serious difficulty. They were probably growing too fast, double-digit growth, a bit like trying to drive an Aston Martin around country lanes at 100 miles an hour. It's a bit dangerous, and they're now frantically trying to slow down and shift their economy away from big building projects and exports to services, and finding it very difficult, exposing a lot of bad debt. And there's a real risk in the next few weeks or months that China will have a crash similar to what happened here. I'm not predicting it, but it could happen. And I was on the Today program this morning talking about this because you're already beginning to see the effects in terms of the collapse of the price of oil, because that's also partly caused by Saudi pumping a lot more. But collapse of demand, also iron ore, copper, many other commodities. And it will affect us here. And our export industries are already beginning to struggle because the growth that we got from the rest of the world isn't there anymore. The second point is that although the financial crisis went away, we still have a lot of problems associated with it. The way I sometimes argue it is that what we had back in 2008 was the economic equivalent of a heart attack. It wasn't just a normal up and down, boom and bust. It was a real shock to the system. And we're still connected to the life support system of very, very low interest rates. And those of you who are studying economics should, I'm sure, reflecting on this, that we're in an absolutely extraordinary position in, well, the UK, throughout the Western world, where interest rates are lower than anybody can ever remember. And there's a brilliant paper produced by a man called Andrew Haldane, who's number 2 in the Bank of England, who's gone through history and concluded that we now have lower interest rates than at any time since the Babylonians. It's very weird. And basically what's happened is that in order to get out of the disaster that we had in 2008 and the big pile-up of debt, central banks have kept interest rates very low. And they've resorted to very extraordinary policies like quantitative easing, which is buying up government securities and driving down the yield, the interest rates. And looking at the world as a whole, we now have a problem which economists will be familiar with, those of you doing A-level, which is that we have a massive overhang of savings in relation to investment. Companies are not comfortable investing. Governments are worried about adding to their debt, so they won't invest. But vast amounts of savings are being accumulated in Germany, in Japan, in China, and this is sort of sitting on top of the system. So that's another of the legacies. A third is that the banking system is still not recovered. I mean, it's not collapsing anymore, but they hold more capital, but the big banks are still not performing in the way that you expect banks to do, which is to take your savings and put them into something productive. They're very reluctant to do that. What the banks do is they put money into property. And what's happening, and I'm sure this is true in the East End as it is in other parts of London, you get this massive escalation of house prices. And this is partly because there's a real scarcity, demand's going up and supply isn't increasing sufficiently, but it's also fueled by credit from the banking system linked to property. And so you've got an extreme problem. Now, in my view, the worst problem in the UK at the moment is housing, and it's creating horrendous problems. Across London, the average house price is now about 500,000. Now, when you think about it, the average earnings, the so-called median earnings, is about 25,000. So it's 20 to 1. I mean, no person on an average income can remotely contemplate house purchase in London, or rents increasingly. So you're creating a big divide between rich and poor, between young people who can't get into the market and older people like me who sitting on a house we bought 30 or 40 years ago and we've paid off the mortgage and because we're getting wealthier simply because the price is going up. And that is another of the legacies of the crisis. So we have this ongoing problem. I don't believe that we're going to get through the next few years without a recurrence of these difficulties. I think Mr. Osborne is to some extent living in a bit of a fool's paradise at the moment. There are a lot of symptoms out there of difficulties, and I think this is going to come back to haunt us. But anyway, I've talked enough. I want to give you a chance to comment, ask questions, but thank you very much for listening and being attentive.